Hello everyone, tonight we start with one of the most intricate, orderly, and imposing civilizations in world history, Imperial China. For more than 2,000 years, it established standards in science, philosophy, warfare, art, and bureaucracy. But do not romanticize it too swiftly, because as stunning as the Forbidden City might appear from a distance, if you lived there, your life would have been the opposite of glamorous. So, before you settle in, take a moment to show support for the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and inform me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see which people are joining us from across the globe. Nov, lover the lights, perhaps activate a fan for that gentle background noise, and let us ease into tonight's expedition together. Welcome to Imperial China, where the instant you leave the womb, society politely gives you a roll and then seals it shut. Imagine the social system like a multi-layered cake, except you are the stale bottom layer, and the frosting never drips down. At the very top, the Emperor, also referred to as the Son of Heaven, which is a lovely title until you realize heaven accepts no complaints. He governs by the mandate of heaven, signifying as long as the crops flourish and rebellions remain quiet, his divine status remains unchallenged. If circumstances go awry, well, guess heaven adjusted its opinion. Time for a new dynasty. Below him are the scholar officials, men who dedicated most of their lives to memorizing Confucian texts, quoting philosophy no person asked for, and developing humps from a lifetime of bamboo scrolls and social superiority. They passed the imperial exams, which were fundamentally the sets, if failure meant being poor forever. Next are the farmers. Yes, the muddy, soon-burned, underfed backbone of society. Confucian doctrine actually respected them. They nourished the empire after all. Unfortunately, respect does not arrive with dental attention or lunch interruptions. Then arrive artisans, the people who crafted items with their hands. Paper, porcelain, fans, frustration, util, absolutely. Respected, not very much. But hey, at least they were not merchants. Merchants. Richer than everyone. Trusted by no one. According to Confucian values, making a profit from other people's labor was morally questionable. So you could be drenched in SFLK and silver, but still be viewed like a tax dodger in a brocade robe. Then we arrived at the societal basement. Soldiers, servants, butchers, actors, and criminals. Basically, any person you would not want to sit beside at a formal banquet. Oh, and monks. Somewhere in a gray area between holy man and we are you bald and barefoot in public. And finally, women, not even on the pyramid. They were more like the gravel around it. Born to obey their fathers, transferred to obey their husbands, and expected to produce sons who could someday obey more men. So, if you were born in Imperial China and wished to pursue your dreams, society had one reply. That is adorable. Nov returned to work. Your day in Imperial China commences bright and early, not because you are a morning individual, but because the rooster is shrieking and the village bell is clanging like it is attempting to summon the afterlife. You open your eyes, stretch your limbs, and then immediately remember you are not permitted to just exist. First, you bow not to a certain abstract deity or noble idea, to your dad. Then your mom, then your grandpa, possibly to your great-aunt if she is still breathing. This is filial piety. And it is not merely encouraged, it is mandatory. Forget to bow. That is not being rude. That is inviting cosmic shame upon 7 generations of your family line. And you do not just bow once. You bow in STPs. You bow when you awake. You bow before eating. You bow when an elder person coughs in your direction. If you are not bowing at least 6 times before breakfast, are you even Chinese? Now, suppose you accidentally speak out of turn during morning teya. Maybe you asked a question like, "Why do I have to wash Uncle's fate?" Well, congratulations. You have now committed unfile acts, which is one small degree above public arson in terms of social disgrace. Better begin rehearsing your apology with 3 full kowtows and an optional forehead to floor gesture. And yes, the furniture is jugging you, too. Most households did not possess hairs unless they were wealthy. So, you're kneeling on woven mats, attempting not to collapse, while your elders start into 45-minute monologues about respect, discipline, and how the world deteriorated ever since the last dynasty. Let us not forget the Confucian hierarchy chart, the spiritual PowerPoint slide that commands who gets to talk, seat, or breathe first. Age triumphs youth. Men outrank woman. Fathers outrank everyone. Even among siblings, older ones can speak over you. If you are the youngest, just nod, smile, and happy you are not blamed for an action another person did. There is no good morning in Imperial China. There is only a series of respectful rituals and a quiet prayer that today you will not accidentally offend a person and get disowned. You have bowed approximately 47 times before 7 a.m. Congratulations, you have survived the opening ceremony of the day. Now it is time for breakfast, the most important meal of the day, to remind you that life is suffering. So what is on the menu? Let us say. A steaming bowl of rice gruel, also known as congee, which is a generous way of saying hot, wet, nothing. It is created by boiling rice in water until the rice surrenders and becomes soup. If you are lucky, it has a little salt. If you are really lucky, a stray sliver of pickled vegetable floats belik ararakoi. If your family is on the poorer end of the spectrum, and let us confess, you are. That bowl of congee is about as exciting as your social prospects. You ate it quietly, respectfully, and under the silent judgment of at least one grandparent who remembers when even gruel was a luxury. Mayat, do not even inquire. That is for festivals, weddings, and imperial officials who have not visited a rice paddy since the Han Dynasty. Eggs are possible, but they are usually preserved in salt or ash until they resemble fossilized sadness. If a person brings out pork belly, you immediately check for visiting relatives or divine intervention. Teya is served, of course, not for relaxation, but because plain water is suspect. Teya at least has been boiled and thus statistically less likely to kill you. You seep it slowly, even though your stomach is still wondering when the meal actually began. Meanwhile, you eat in silence. Meals are not for chatter. You do not discuss dreams, goals, or how you cried last night thinking about the imperial exam. You eat facing the ancestral shrine, silently thankful for your ancestors, even if they left you a thatched roof, chronic anemia, and impossible family expectations. The bowls are rough ceramic. The spoons are made of wood. There is no napkin. You wipe your mouth with your slab if it is clean enough, and get ready to start working off the meal you barely consumed. And as you rise, your father nods once. It swiftly. Heaven favors the diligent, which roughly translates to, return to work. We have got dynasties to maintain. You have finished your bowl of existential porridge, and now it is time to get dressed. Not to impress, but to not get fined, flogged, or mistaken for a social class above your station. Because in Imperial China, what you wear is not about self-expression. It is about survival. Let us begin with fabric hierarchy. Are you a farmer? Hemp. Coarse, itchy, scratchy hemp. the medieval equivalent of wearing a potato sack, dip it in disappointment. Are you a noble? Silk, glorious shimmering silk that flows like poetry and whispers tax the puissance more. And guess what? If you are caught wearing the wrong fabric, you are not just unfashionable. You are committing a crime. Clothing was not just a matter of comfort. It was law. The government had detailed regulations on slave width, hot chape, belt ornaments, and even color. Yellow, for instance, was reserved exclusively for the emperor. Wear yellow as a commoner, and you are not starting a fashion trend. You are starting your own execution. Let us discuss footwear. Cloth shoes for peasants, embroidered silk slippers for the elite. Practicality, optional. Comfort, unlikely. You did not dress for the weather. You dressed for the dynasty, and now the fayette. Specifically, foot binding, the aesthetic equivalent of turning your toes into a curled-up secret. If you were a high-born girl, your fayette were broken, folded under, and bound tightly from the age of five. Why? Because tiny deformed fayette, called lotus fayette, were considered beautiful. A woman's worth was literally measured by how effectively she could hobble across a room without falling. It was not just painful, it was permanent. Foot binding crippled generations of women, turning walking into an act of art and agony. But do not worry, at least you got to wear embroidered shoes no person ever saw, because walking far was not really an option anymore. Even men did not escape wardrobe misery. Bureaucrats wore heavy, layered robes year-round, even in summer, because status always outranked sweat. Some outfits even had winged hat flaps, designed to keep officials from whispering to each other during court. So yes, Imperial Chinese fashion was elegant, symbolic, and deeply political. But it also chafed, pinched, overheated, or outright shattered your bones. Beauty is pain, they say. But here, pain was mandatory, and beauty was a government-approved dress code. You are now properly dressed in your socially acceptable potato fiber tunic. Greyat, time to head out and earn your daily calories, assuming the land, weather, and taxes allow it. Let us be honest, in Imperial China, work was not a calling. It was a never-ending endurance test designed by Confucius and enforced by people who have never touched a shovel in their lives. If you are a farmer, and statistically you will spend your entire life bent over a rice paddy, not in a poetic cinematic way. No, this is literal backbreaking labor. You wake up before the sun, plant seedlings knee-deep in muck, swat away mosquitoes the size of small birds, and pray the landlord does not increase your grain tax again this year. Rain, you work. Drought, you work harder. Locusts work and scream at the ski simultaneously. The tools are basic. A wooden plow if you are lucky, your bare hands if you are not. Your ox is your closest companion and your retirement plan. Law's him, and it is just you, versus 10 acres of disappointment. Now, let us say you are a woman. Your workload has a sequel. You will help in the fields and cook, clay in, spin thread, weave fabric, raise children, and somehow still be blamed when dinner is latte or your husband sneezes wrong. Rest. That is an activity noble ladies do while debating poetry. Artisans do not have it much better. You spend hours making pottery, paper, or tools by hand, then sell them for barely enough to buy stalled tofu. And merchants, technically richer, but socially shamed. You could buy half the village and still be treated like a walking moral failure. Then there is corvée labor, government-mandated service. One day, the emperor may need a new road, canal, or tomb. Guess who is helping build it for free with a smile and no shoes? You refuse, and you are branded a criminal, or worse, a rebel. And at the end of it all, you trug a home covered in dirt to a bowl of thin porridge and the quiet satisfaction of not dying. Today, in Imperial China, work does not set you free. It just keeps you too tired to rebel. Ah, the Imperial exam system, the grand passage to upward mobility, or as it is more accurately known, the eternal written torture chamber of China. If you were a man born with a sliver of ambition and a family slightly wealthier than dirt, your life path was clear. Pass the civil service exam, succeed, and you would become an official, respected, powerful, with silk robes and actual chairs to sit on. Fail back to the rice fields, peasant. Simple, not even close. These exams were less multiple choice and more memorize the entire Confucian canon, word for word, and write poetic essays that would make a 1,000-year-old ghost weep. Imagine being judged not just on grammar and meaning, but on whether your handwriting flows like a morally upright river. One smudge, one character out of place, one metaphor too edgy, instant failure. Studying commenced in early childhood and did not stop until your hairline did. Boys crammed inside a freezing studi hoots or boiled themselves alive in summer, scribbling out essays until their fingers curled permanently into brush-holding claws. Tutors drilled doctrine into your skull like academic blacksmiths. Your social life gone. Your hobbies Confucius. Your dreams still Confucius. The top exam, the Ginshi, was held in the capital. You were locked in a cubicle the size of a coffin with nothing but paper, ink, and soul-crushing anxiety. You brought your own food, blanket, and chamber pot. Some examinees fainted. Others went mad. A few died. Yes, literally died from the pressure, and they were not even given partial credit. Even if you passed the first round, more exams awaited, district, provincial, national. Years could go by, decades. Saw men tested into their 60s. One guy reportedly took the exam more than 40 times. That is not determination, that is trauma with a calligraphy pen, and if you failed, social shame. Your family, who sacrificed everything for your education, would be disappointed, and loudly so. Your neighbors would whisper, your mother might cry. Your father might give you the look, you know the one, the we were not you born smarter stare. So yes, the exam could lift you to greatness or break your mind, your body, and your lineage. All for the chance to be overworked, underpaid, and micromanaged by palace eunuchs. Worth it? That is up to Confucius. Feeling dirty yet? Do not worry, you will. Because in Imperial China, personal hygiene was not so mook, Alifa style, as it was a seasonal suggestion. Let us begin with the basics. Bathing. It happened sometimes. Maybe once every few weeks if you were lucky and not freezing to death. In summer, sure, a dip in the river. In winter, you might go a month without a proper wash. And no, there was no lavender-scented sop. Soap, when oozed, was made from animal fat and ashes, a gritty blend that felt like exfoliating with misery. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in larger cities. But privacy was not really a thing. You would be scrubbing your armpits next to an elderly merchant and a shrieking toddler while a monk recited hygiene proverbs in the corner. Refreshing toothpaste, try salt, charcoal, or powdered bonus. Toothbrushes were made from animal hair tied to bamboo. Effective only if your goal was to mildly disturb your plaque into relocating. Dental hygiene was not great, which is probably why most older adults smiled like haunted jack-o'-lanterns. And then there were the parasites, lice, fleas, bed bugs. These were less pests and more roommates. It did not matter how rich you were. If you had hair, you had company. Comb shops flourished because everyone needed a lite comb, and if you did not, you scratched your scalp like you were trying to summon lightning. Clothing was not helping. You wore the same outfit for weeks. Washing clothes required hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing by hand, and praying your shirt did not disintegrate into fibers. Underwear existed, but was not a daily requirement, especially for peasants who often wore none at all. Risky business. And do not forget the toilets, or actually dough for your own sake. A toilet was typically a hole in the ground, occasionally surrounded by wooden boards if you were fancy. Public latrines, functional in the same way, a haunted well is functional, smelly, crowded, and always one step away from biological disaster. Imperial China had silk, philosophy, poetry, and palaces. But if you wanted a long, hot, private shower, you were about 1,500 years too early. So, you have survived the lice, the breakfast disappointment, and the soul-crushing exam prep. But before you even think about complaining to your neighbor, remember in Imperial China, the law is always watching. And unlike modern surveillance, this one comes with bamboo sticks and very creative punishments. Let us begin with the Leal Code. Imperial dynasties, particularly during the Tang and Qing periods, were known for having exhaustively detailed laws. There were laws about taxes, hairstyles, hat chappies, how to grieve properly, and how long you were allowed to mourn your in-laws. Accidentally wear the wrong color on the wrong festival day. Technically criminal. And yes, they kept receipts. Official bamboo strip records, inked and filed by overworked scribes who probably hated their job. Punishment was not subtle. Forget modern courtrooms and community service. Imperial justice believed in education through suffering. For meaner offenses, you might get flogged with a bamboo rod. Fun fact, the court even had different sizes of sticks depending on the crime. Light insult, small stick. Stole a chicken, bigger stick. Failed to bow deeply enough to a magistrate's horse, surprise stick combo. For more serious crimes, things escalated quickly. You could be branded tattooed on the face with your cream, sent into exile, or if you really upset an important person, executed in public, slowly. Torture was not an exception, it was procedure. If you were accused of an act, the court would often help. Encourage your confession with thumbscrews, kneeling on spiked boards, or long hours in a stressed position while being shouted at by a man with a scroll and no sense of humor. And here is the best part. You did not even have to be guilty. Just suspicious, inconvenient, or politically unlucky. Even your family could be held accountable. The law loved collective punishment. If your cousin said an act seditious during a Reese wine binge, you might wake up to find your house under investigation, because guilt apparently was hereditary. The law was structured. It was advanced. It was terrifying. Justice in Imperial China was less about fairness and more about obedience. The message was clear. Behave, respect the order. And whatever you do not make eye contact with the magistrate's concubine. Welcome to the imperial justice system's favorite hobby, torture. Not as a punishment, but as a handy pretrial icebreaker. Let us say a person accuses you of stealing a chicken, disrespecting your father, or heaven forbid, expressing a controversial opinion about the emperor's poetry. The magistrate does not start by asking for your side of the story. No, this is Imperial China. You start by getting tied to a bench while they bring out the confession toolkit. First up, the bamboo rod used for beating your back, buttocks, or thighs until you are sorry for crimes you may not even understand. It was not random violence. They kept official punishment logs, counting every stroke with bureaucratic precision. 30 lashes for theft, 40 pet for lying, 1 bonus lash for squirming. Still denying guilt, time to upgrade. Kneeling on speaked boards was a classic. You kneel on rough wood embedded with stones or glass until your legs give out or your will dies. It is a little like yoga if yoga were invented by angry civil servants. Then there is the finger crusher. 2 slabs of wood tightened with rope around your fingers. Fun fact, it was called the small tiger bench, which sounds adorable until your bones snap like kindling. It is hard to read a confession with broken fingers, but they did not really care about penmanship. And yes, this was standard procedure. Torture was not seen as morally questionable. It was simply the most efficient way to get the truth, or at least a version of it that matched the official narrative. If you still would not confess, they would just escalate. Some punishments involved being stretched, whipped, or left tied up in the summer sun while officials took a lunch break. And do not bother screaming, the neighbors are used to eat. Now imagine you are innocent. Congratulations, you still get tortured because a clean confession was needed for proper record keeping. Better to admit to an act than risk being labeled uncooperative. Imperial logic at its finest. So, next time you complain about modern bureaucracy, remember at least the DMV does not be at you with bamboo until you admit you might have parked improperly in 1372. You may think you are alone, but in Imperial China, a person is always watching. And no, it is not just your judgmental grandmother. The surveillance state was not digital. It was human, carefully trained, state-approved, and terrifyingly thorough. It began at the village level, where every town had a local baoja or village elder who was not just there to hand out rice. He was also your friendly neighborhood informant, your neighbors also spies, your extended family absolutely spies, your servant who claims to be illiterate, and definitely a spy. People were incentivized to report suspicious behavior. And suspicious could mean anything from hoarding too much grain to coughing during a tribute spec. Even staying too quiet could raise eyebrows. What are you hiding, citizen? In the cities, you had a sophisticated network of yamen runners, scribes, and magistrate assistants whose job was to investigate crimes, deliver messages, and casually observe everything you did. Every dynasty had its own version of this machine. But the goal remained the same. Keep the peace by peeking through every available crack. Especially fond of surveillance were the eunuchs in the imperial palace. Those castrated courtiers who could not feather children but absolutely could start coups. Many controlled their own secret police forces, operated spy rings, and whispered in the ears of emperors. Some eunuchs wielded more power than ministers simply by knowing who said what to whom and when. And do not even try complaining about the system, criticizing the emperor even indirectly, like sighing. The "Sun looks a little tired today" could be interpreted as slander. Poets learned to master the art of subtlety. Everyone else just mastered the art of shutting up. What is worse, the government often published lists of executed criminals as a warning, complete with names and crimes. It was like an ancient Facebook feed, but with more beheadings. So if you had a rebellious thought, you kept it to yourself. If you had a rebellious cousin, you turned him in. And if a person smiled too weed while asking about your political opinions, that was your cue to fake a cough and run. Because in Imperial China, the walls had ears, and so did the trees, the neighbors, and probably your Reese ball. In Imperial China, marriage was not about falling in love under the cherry blossoms. It was about duty, negotiation, and dowries so heavy they could break your ox cart's axle. Love that was for poems, not people. Let us start with the basics. Marriages were arranged always. Parents decided your fate while you were still learning how to hold chopsticks. If your family had status, they would hire a matchmaker, a professional snoop who compared horoscopes, family records, and whether your future spouse's ancestors had ever done an act embarrassing 5 dynasties ago. If everything aligned, congratulations. You are engaged to a person you have probably never met. Physical attraction, personality, shared interests, irrelevant. Compatibility was measured in birth charts and tax records. For women, marriage was not an exciting new chapter. It was a polite kidnapping with ceremonial robes. You left your family forever, changed your surname, and moved into your husband's home, where you were now expected to serve not only him, but his parents, his grandparents, and whatever cranky uncle happened to be living in the guest room. The dowry system meant your family had to send money, goods, or land with you. The more, the better. Think of it as ancient China's version of thanks for taking her off our hands. In return, the groom's family might give betrothal gifts, but don't get too excited. Sometimes that meant silks and jewelry. Other times, a slightly nicer chicken. Once married, your job was clear. Produce male hairs, obey your in-laws, and never ever talk back. A wife was expected to be modest, silent, and hard-working, the holy trinity of Confucian womanhood. If you were too loud, too opinionated, or heaven forbid, barren, you might get replaced legally with a concubine. Speaking of which, yes, concubinage was a thing. Men could take multiple concubines, especially if they were rich. Woman, one man, one shot at survival. Divorce, rare, social suicide. The only acceptable grounds were 7 outs, including jealousy, disease, or excessive gossip. So if your tea-drinking habits annoyed your husband enough, he could legally dump you. Nice. In short, marriage in Imperial China was less happily ever after and more try not to get exiled for serving cold noodles. So you are thinking of rebelling. Maybe you are tired of back-breaking labor, endless bowing, or that smug magistrate who taxed your ris and your dignity in the same afternoon. Bold move. Unfortunately, in Imperial China, rebellion did not make you a hero. It made you a very short-lived headline. Let us start with the fantasy. You gather a ragtag band of paysans, burn your landlord's tax ledgers, and proclaim a glorious new era of justice. The problem, the Imperial Army arrives 3 days later with horses, crossbows, and no sense of humor. You say the emperors were not just bureaucrats in gold hats. They were obsessed with stability. Confucian ideology taught that rebellion meant disorder, and disorder meant the universe was out of whack. That made you not just a criminal, but a cosmic threat, and the punishment for cosmic threats dramatic. You would be captured, parodied, tortured, and often executed in a way specifically designed to discourage creative thinking. Public beheadings were popular. So was quartering. One emperor preferred slow slicing, a charming method where you were cut repeatedly until your paperwork and your torso were complete. And it did not stop with you. The imperial government loved a good collective punishment. Your family, your neighbors, even that one guy who once lent you a hoy. They were all fair game. The logic was simple. If we arouse your entire village, no person will rebel again. Effective, terrifying. Still, rebellions did happen. From the Yellow Turban Rebellion to the White Lotus Uprising, desperate people occasionally rose up. And while some sparked chaos, most were brutally crushed. The survivors were either enslaved, silenced, or drafted into public works projects they would not survive long enough to finish. Even talking about rebellion was dangerous. Writing a sassy poem that hinted at discontent, boom, arrested. Confess under bamboo interrogation. If you are lucky, you get exiled to the outer provinces to think about your actions somewhere cold, rocky, and strategically flea infested. So yes, rebellion sounded romantic, the stuff of dramas and legends. But in reality, you were more likely to become a cautionary tale carved onto a public plaque. Want to change the system? Best to keep your head down, literally. So maybe you thought, if I cannot make it as a peasant, maybe I will rise through the ranks, ace the exams, and live a comfortable life as a government official. Adorable. Welcome to court life in Imperial China, where yes, the tea is hot, the robes are silk, and the palace floors are polished to a divine sheen, but so are the knees heating behind everyone's backs. Let us begin with the Forbidden City, the Emperor's heavily guarded wonderland. In Sidi, everyone is smiling and plotting. Eunuchs, ministers, concubines, Scholar officials, all locked in a constant game of polite treachery. The only thing more cutthroat than court life was actual throat-cutting, which also happened a lot. If you were an official, your every move was watched, not just by spies, but by rivals waiting for you to mess up, feel a report with the wrong character, trahison. Mispronounce the emperor's name during a reading. Trahison hesitat before kneeling. Trahison adjacent at the very least. And let us talk about eunuchs, castrated palace servants who wielded disproportionate power. Many started humbly, rose swiftly, and became gatekeepers to the emperor's inner world. Upset a eunuch. You might find your promotion mysteriously delayed or your name added to a secret accidental disappearance list. Meanwhile, the imperial harem was not a romantic fantasy. It was a high-stakes political battlefield. Concubines vied for favor, sabotaged rivals, and hoped to birth a prince. Preferably one who did not get poisoned before age 5. The empress might technically be in charge, but good luck controlling 30 jealous women with nothing to do but shame creatively. Even poetry was risky. Compose the wrong metaphor about wilting flowers or a crumbling wall, and a person might decide you are criticizing the emperor. There were officials executed for reading poems about the weather because the emperor took the hint. And when the emperor died, oh, now the real fun began. Succession disputes, secret wills, mysterious deaths, unfortunate illnesses. Half the court usually did not survive the transition. So no, court life was not sapphire. It was just death in a silk wrapper. Your robe might be red, but so was the floor beneath it. You have made it this far, bowed, bled, memorized 400 Confucian sayings, and dodged at least 3 types of death. But here is the grand truth about life in Imperial China. You were a statistic, a head count, a line item on a dusty tax ledger. To the empire, you were not a person with hopes and dreams. You were a grain of rice, small, anonymous, easily crushed, and ideally harvested for labor or revenue. The state did not care if you had ambition, talent, or inner beauty. It cared if your family paid its taxes on time and produced able-bodied sons to draft into the next border defense project. From the emperor's viewpoint, you were one speck among hundreds of millions, and not even a glamorous speck. You were not the golden imperial seal or a sacred relic. You were a moving part in a reese-producing, silk-spinning canal, digging machine built to sustain dynastic continuity. Your birth was recorded not for celebration, but for future tax extraction. Your death was noted mostly so your family would not keep trying to claim your rations. And in between, your life's purpose was to not cause problems. Stay in line, fulfill your role, and try not to starve during a drought. Individualism, gute idea. It did not exist. You did not follow your passion. You followed your father, your master, or your assigned bureaucratic rank. The idea of being unique, of standing out, was as threatening to the state as a crop blight or a Mongol invasion. Harmony was everything. Even your emotions were expected to be in line with your social status. Feeling sad as a peasant, acceptable. Feeling inspired, sit down. The census did not ask what your favorite poem was. It asked if your roof leaked and whether you owned a pig. Even your body belonged to the system. Drafted for public works, you might be sent to build a canal you would never benefit from, or guard a wall you would never see finished. Die along the way? No problem. There were always more grains where you came from. In Imperial China, you mattered, but only as long as you could be counted, taxed, or buried quietly. So here we are, 15 chapters deep. And if you have been paying attention, one thing is clear. Imperial China was magnificent and magnificently merciless. Yes, this civilization gave the world some of its most profound inventions. Gunpowder, paper, the compass, printing, bureaucracy that actually worked mostly. The Great Wall snaked across mountains. The Forbidden City stood like a jewel of imperial will, and poetry flowed like the Yellow River. Beautiful, endless, and often fatal if interpreted incorrectly. The legacy unmatched. The reality backbreaking, hierarchical, and constantly one bad rice harvest away from collapse. For every elegant brushstroke recorded in a scholar's diary, there were 10,000 peasants ankle-deep in mood, wondering whether this year's tax grain would leave anything left to eat. For every emperor buried beneath a mountain of jade and gold, there were hundreds of laborers buried beneath the same mountain because they were inconvenient witnesses. The brilliance of Imperial China did not come at cheap. It was paid for in childhoods lost to exam study, backs spent from field work, and levees cut short by law, famine, or conscription. The system worked brilliantly for the top few. For everyone else, it worked them until they collapsed. And the worst part, most of them accepted it, not because they love oppression, but because the system had convinced them it was the natural order of things. That heaven had appointed their emperor, that filial piety, obedience, and silence were virtues, that suffering quietly was a form of virtue. That legacy, the duality of splendor and suffering, is what still echoes today. When people look back at Imperial China, they often see the calligraphy, the architecture, the philosophical qualities carved into stone. They do not always see the concubine poisoned in the harem, the starving mother selling her comb for reis, or the scholar who failed the exam for the 7th team and simply disappeared. So no, you would not last a day in Imperial China. Not because you are soft, but because that world was not built for survival. It was built for endurance, tradition, and control. And yet through it all, the empire endured. The people endured, but only a few of their stories were ever told. In the spring of 1846, the great westward migration was in full swing. The Oregon Trail pulsed with life, oxen trudging, wagon wheels creaking, and families dreaming of new beginnings. Among these travelers was a group of roughly 30 people, led by brothers George and Jacob Donner and businessman James F. Reed. They were not fortune seekers or adventurers. They were farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and children chasing the promise of California's fertile valleys. Their teaming seemed perfect. The snows would not fall for months, and the well-worn path west had carried thousands before them. But the Donner Party, latter numbering 87 people, made one critical error that would set them on a path toward tragedy. They chose to take a shortcut. The so-called shortcut was the Hastings-Kuthoff, an untested route promoted by Lansford Hastings, an opportunist who had never even traveled it himself with a wagon. It promised to shave weeks off the journey by cutting through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had sent guides ahead to leave letters encouraging immigrants to take his new route. The Donner Party, trusting those letters, left the traditional trail and followed his suggestion. At first, spirits remained high. The group included children, elderly parents, and entire families who sang hymns at night and held tight to hope. But trouble began quickly. The Wasatch Mountains were far more treacherous than Hastings claimed. The wagons had to be dismantled, hauled piece by piece, and reassembled. Progress slowed to a crawl. Tempers flared. Supplies dwindled. Then came the desert, the Great Salt. Lac Desert was a brutal, shimmering hell. Hastings had said it would take 2 days to cross. It took 5. Water barrels ran dry. Animals collapsed. Oxen went mad. Entire wagons were abandoned in the alkaline dust. They had already lost precious team, and winter was no longer far behind them. By the team, they rejoined the main trail. They had lost weeks. Other wagon trains were already over the Sierra Nevada. The Donner Party, exhausted and behind schedule, pushed onward, unaware that the most harrowing part of their journey still lay ahead. The dream of California was still in their minds, but the mountains did not care about dreams. And soon, neither would starvation. By late October 1846, the Donner Party finally reached the eastern base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was supposed to be the last great obstacle before descending into California's promised lands. But the mountains were not just high, they were merciless, and winter was arriving early. The party was now fractured. Some families had forged ahead, while others, including the Donners and the Reeds, lagged behind, slowed by broken wagons, injured oxen, and sheer exhaustion. Snow began to fall, light at first, then relentless. Within days, the passes became impossible. They were trapped. They camped at Truckee-Laka, what is now called Donner-Laka, and others stopped further back at Alder Creek. Makeshift cabins were built from pina logs and wagon parts. They slaughtered their remaining animals. Hides were turned into crude tents. The snow kept falling over 6 Fayette, then 10. The hunger came quickly. Rations were reduced. The livestock was gone. They boiled strips of rawhide and gnawed on leather belts. One child tried to eat a blanket. Another chewed on a piece of bark until their gums bled. Every morning brought another cold body. Death moved slowly, politely, then cruelly. Inside of those cabins there was no warmth, just smoke, hunger, and silence. Mothers tried to comfort starving children. Fathers stared out into the endless snow, calculating how far they might get on foot. Arguments broke out. Hope thinned like the mountain air. On November 12th, a blizzard sealed their fate. Snow peeled up to the roofs, trays snapped under the weight. Any thought of escape was buried under white silence. The pass was closed, and the dream of California was gone, replaced by a desperate singular thought: survival. By mid-December, with no rescue in sight, 15 of the strongest members formed what would be called the Forlorn Hope Party. 10 men and 5 women strapped crude snowshoes to their feet and attempted to cross the mountains on foot, carrying measure rations and the unbearable burden of what might come next. Behind them, dozens remained at camp, starving, dying, and waiting in a frozen purgatory. And for the Forlorn Hope, the question was not if they would survive. It was who would die first and who would eat them. On December 16, 1846, 15 desperate souls stepped into the snow and vanished into history. They were dubbed the Forlorn Hope, not by the newspapers, but by their fellow immigrants who watched them go, knowing full well what the word forlorn meant. Lost, hopeless, doomed. Each member carried only what they could: scraps of dried oxhide, flint, a rife, and shredded blankets. They built crude snowshoes, hopping to stay above the deep drifts, but it barely worked. The snow was powdery and endless. They slogged for miles each day, slowed by exhaustion and the icy grip of high-altitude wilderness. Within days, they were lost. The food ran out almost immediately. They had miscalculated the distance. A squirrel was caught, a pine cone boiled, and then a man collapsed. Franklin Gravis, the oldest in the group. His daughters sobbed as he died in the snow. There was nothing they could do. And then, one by one, others began to fall. Antonio, the Mexican teamster, Patrick Dolan, raving and delirious, Lemuel Murphy, just 13. Death came not as a storm, but as a slow hush. It was silent, white, inescapable. Then came the moment the line crossed in desperation and cold logic. The survivors carved mayat from their fallen companions. They wept, prayed, vomited, and ate again. It was not savagery. It was calculus: starve or leave. Sarah Gravis, used 19, later recalled the first taste. She never spoke of it again. William Foster, gaunt and silent, kept his thoughts to himself. Marianne Gravis held her sister's hand and whispered that it did not matter what they had to do so long as they got home. By the time they stumbled out of the mountains weeks later, only 7 had survived: 5 women and 2 men. Their eyes were sunken, their cheeks frostbitten, their mouths silent. But they brought an object far more powerful than supplies or maps. They brought news. There were dozens still alive, trapped at Donnerlake, starving, freezing, waiting, and they needed help now. California, which had largely ignored the Donner mess, suddenly woke up. The horror was too great, the shame too large. Rescue parties were organized, but by the time they arrived, the snow had grown even deeper, and in the cabins by the loch, what they would find was beyond imagining. The first rescue party arrived at Donnerlake in February 1847, 2 months after the Forlorn Hope emerged from the mountains. What they found was not a camp. It was a graveyard. Cabins were half buried in snow, doors frozen shut. Inside, People sat motionless, too weak to stand, their eyes glazed over from starvation. Children lie beside their dead parents. Frozen bodies were stacked like firewood, and the smell, thick, sickly, unforgettable, spoke of what had happened when the mayat ran out. Some tried to speak, others simply stared. Of the 87 who had started the journey, nearly half were dead, and those still breathing were barely human anymore. Gaunt skeletal figures wrapped in filthy heads, whispering prayers to an indifferent ski. The rescuer had brought supplies, flour, dried mayat, blankets, but not enough to save everyone. There was no way to carry dozens through snow drifts taller than wagons. They had to make impossible decisions. Children were chosen first, the smallest, the lightest. Those with the greatest chance of surviving the trek back down the mountains. Parents stayed behind, watching silently as strangers carried away their children, unsure if they would ever see them again. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions followed. H had to battle whiteouts, avalanches, and terrain that had swallowed the Donner Party whole. With every return trip, the rescuers brought fewer supplies and found fewer survivors and darker stories. The truth began to lack out, not just of starvation, but of cannibalism. Of how, in the worst nights when all was lost, some survivors had fed on the dead. Some even whispered that others had killed to feed. The names were kept quiet, the rumors louder than the facts. Some were Judge Ed, others Petey Ed. Mauston were simply too traumatized to speak. James Reid, who had been banished early in the journey for killing a man in self-defense, returned as a rescuer. Against all odds, he found his wife and children still alive. George Donner, however, lay dying at Alder Creek, his arm gangrenous. His wife, Tamsen, refused to leave him. She stayed behind when the others left and never made it out. When the final survivors reached California in April 1847, the ordeal was over. But the scars, emotional, cultural, and historical, were just beginning to form. News of the Donner. Party's ordeal spread east like wildfire, twisting with each retelling, growing darker, more grotesque. Newspapers could not get enough of E.T. America, gripped by manifest destiny favor, was suddenly staring at its shadow. The story was too irresistible. Pioneers chasing paradise turned cannibals in the snow. Some headlines called it the cannibal horror of the Sierra. Others accused survivors of murder. It was not just scandal. It was a national reckoning. The westward expansion had always been sold as glorious, godly, and inevitable. But now it was stained with the image of starving settlers roasting human flesh over pine-wood fires. Journalists fixated on every ghastly detail. Who oughta whom? Who died nobly and who took too long to die? Sarah Graves, one of the survivors, was hounded for interviews. So was Mary Murphy, who lost almost her entire family. Survivors were caught between fame and shame. Prized for surviving, yet judged for how they did eat. James Reid, 11 a disgracia de exilo, returned to San Jose a changed man, haunted but vindicated. His leadership during the rescue missions earned him public sympathy, and he spent much of his latter life trying to protect the reputations of the survivors, but even he could not silence the whispers. Tamsen Donner became a tragic symbol, a devoted wife who stayed behind with her dying husband, refusing rescue more than once. When she finally tried to leave with a group of men, she never made it. Her fate was murky. Some said she died of cold. Others suggested she had been killed and eaten by the very men she trusted. The government, for its part, said little. California was on the brink of becoming U.S. territory, and the last thing officials wanted was to tarnish the dream of westward expansion. The incident was brushed aside as an unfortunate tragedy, an anomaly, no inquiry, no formal investigation. And yet, in every parlor and saloon, people talked about the Donners. The name itself became a cautionary tale. Children were warned, do not take shortcuts. Do not stray from the trail, or you might end up like them. But beneath the horror, an object more complex lingered. Questions about survival, morality, and just how thin the veneer of civilization really is when the snow will not stop falling. For those who lived through the Sierra nightmare, the journey did not end when the snow melted. Survival came at a price. Etched into bone and memory, the survivors emerged from the mountains, but they never truly left them behind. Many were children. They returned to civilization as walking ghosts, queet, underfed, wide-eyed. Some, like Virginia Reid, just 13 at the time, would go on to leave long leaves. She eventually married, had children, and even published letters recounting her ordeal. But beneath her composed surface lay trauma that pulsed like an old wound. Others fared worse. Mary Murphy, after losing her entire family, married young and died within a few years. Louis Caseberg, a German immigrant who had been among the last rescued, was branded forever by rumors that he hadn't only consumed the dead, but murdered them to Dessau. He sued a newspaper for libel and won $1 in damages. It did not matter, the Stein never left him. Somme survivors tried to disappear. They changed their names, moved far from California, or refused to speak about what happened. Others could not stop talking, haunted not just by what they had done, but by what they had seen others do. It was not just the cannibalism. It was the slow unraveling of humanity, watching friends wither into skeletons, hearing the silent weeping of mothers who could no longer feed their children, choosing who to save when rescue came because there was never room for all. Communities, too, reacted differently. Somme treated the survivors with pity and respect, acknowledging their suffering as heroic endurance. Others whispered and gossiped, eager to distance themselves from what had become a living nightmare etched into the American frontier myth. James Reed, to his credit, rebuilt his reputation. He served in the Mexican-American War, prospered in San Jose, and lived to an old age. But even he admitted in letters that the images of the dead, the sounds of the camp, stayed with him always. No person who survived the Donner Party returned unchanged. Whether they were 8 or 80, they had stared into the void of desperation and made choices most people pray they will never face. And in that silence between hunger and horror, they left behind a truth few wanted to admit. Survival is not always Klayan. It is not always noble. Sometimes it simply means living with what you had to become. The Sierra Nevada never forgot the Donners. The loch where many of them waited out the blizzards where they died, starved, and fed is now known as Donner Loch, a postcard of natural beauty with a name that hums with unease. Over time, the landscape became a part of the legend. Tourists come to see the site where the cabins once stood, to walk the snowy trails where the forlorn hope had trudged, to gaze at the mountains that had refused to let the pioneers pass. Locals told stories. Some whispered that the place was cursed, that the trees still remembered, that the winds carried voices. In 1918, a granite monument was erected near the loch. On top stands a solemn pioneer family, father, mother, and child, facing westward, ever hopeful. The pedestal beneath them is 22 feet tall, marking the height of the snow that winter. It is a monument to endurance, to tragedy, to the thin line between civilization and survival. But even in stone, the story remains uneasy. The monument says nothing of cannibalism, nothing of the quiet desperation, the betrayals, or the dead who were consumed to keep others alive. It is a sanitized memory, one designed for public comfort, not historical truth. Every year, school children visit the site. They hear the basic version. Pioneers, trapped, survived. Maybe a mention of starvation. Rarely the rest. It is easier to honor greet than to stare into the face of what survival cost. Still, the mountains remember the paths they took are still there, buried under ski resorts and hiking trails. The spot where Tamsin Donner stayed behind with her dying husband. Now a picnic area, the frozen cabin where children wept in silence, replaced by interpretive plaques. And yet the air feels heavy, as if the ground still holds the memory of boots crunching over snow, of mothers rocking dead infants, of strangers sharing mayat with trembling hands and averted eyes. Nature does not care. It offers no apologies. But the story persists. Not just because it is haranguing, but because it is human. The Donner Party was not just about failure or cannibalism. It was about how far people will go to protect their families, to cling to hope, to choose life, even in its most terrible form. And in the silence of the mountains, that choice still echoes. In the decades that followed, the story of the Donner Party evolved, warped by memory, distorted by gossip, and reshaped by the needs of a nation addicted to drama. The facts were gruesome enough, but that did not stop storytellers from making them worse, or in some cases, more heroic. Some survivors were romanticized, cast as tragic pioneers who had faced hell and returned with scars. Others, like Louis Kzerberg, became villains in the popular imagination. He was charged with hoarding provisions, with murdering Tams and Donna, and with relishing what he had to do to continue living. Not one of these allegations was verified. But veracity in an epoch of printing presses and cheap books was never the primary objective. The populace adored extremes. They did not want nuance. They demanded either saints or monsters. This made existence after the ordeal arduous. Every interview, every newspaper illustration, and every fictional account reopened injuries. A few survivors attempted to correct the record. Virginia Reed, many years later, released her own narrative. She pleaded with future pioneers to avoid shortcuts and to heed those with expertise. Others remained silent, worn out by the burden of their memories and the world's fascination with them. By the late 19th century, the Donner Party had evolved into folklore. Campfire stories narrated in whispered tones, a cautionary story taught to schoolchildren, a metaphor for poor planning, for hubris, for what occurs when people believe the wrong advice. The Hastings CFF became notorious, a synonym for deadly shortcuts. And with passing time, the true horror of the story, the cannibalism, was oozed to conceal the deeper tragedy, that the entière expérience could have been avoided. That bad leadership, arrogant promises, and systemic inexpertise took more lives than snow ever did. Still, there is a uniquely American aspect in how the tale endured. It is not just a story of failure. It is a story of obsession with movement, with reinvention. With the fantasy of taming nature and destiny, the Donner Party was a mirror reflecting not just desperation, but the myth of westward perfection fracturing under its own weight. The reality is there were no heroes, no villains, just humans facing impossible choices. And while the snow melted and team moved forward, the question never truly dissipated. What would you have done today? The Donner Party exists as more than a footnote in American history. It is a symbol distorted, debated, and profoundly uncomfortable. Unlike other tales of pioneering greed, this one refuses to rest naively in the gallery of noble westward expansion. It is a story that still bites. We remember the cannibalism, yes, but that was merely the final act. The Rea el legacy is found in everything that led to it. The illusion of shortcuts, the fatal power of poor leadership, the faith placed in maps crafted by dreamers instead of realists. The Donner Party showcased the fragility of the American dream when challenged against the harsh indifference of nature. And yet, in that collapse, we also discover another element: endurance. The survivors did not merely descend from the mountains. They rebuilt, married, had children. A portion stayed in California. Others relocated to escape the whispers. A small number even became quietly prosperous. Their lives were not defined by what they had done to continue living, but by the choice to keep living afterward. But the cost of that survival is eternal. The site at Donner Lake still exists, preserved and somber. Visitors stroll through penetres and melting snow, reading plaques about hunger and courage. Tour guides speak in quiet voices. Historians argue over the details. Writers still cannot leave the story alone because the Donna Party poses questions that history usually avoids. What occurs when every remaining option is the one you swore you would never select? What occurs when the dream of paradise becomes a snowy tomb? And if survival is all that is left, does it still matter how you attain it? There are no satisfactory answers, just echos and bonas buried beneath the snow. In the end, the Donna Party reminds us that human strength is not measured in glory, but in resolve, not in conquest, but in the brutal, terrible choice to keep breathing, even when every comfort, law, and illusion of civilization has been removed. So we remember them not just for what they did, but for what they endured, not as legends or cautionary tales, but as people, terrified, determined, flawed, and human. And in the Sierra winds, their story still whispers through the trees, forever frozen in time, forever unfinished. Wuja was not born into royalty. She was born into something much more perilous, ambition draped in silk. The year was 624 CE, and the Tang dynasty was still young, glowing with promise and poetry. Her father was a timber merchant, wealthy enough to provide his daughters with rare privileges, tutors, books, and the radical idea that a girl's mind could be just as sharp as any boy's sword. From an early age, Wuja was different. While her contemporaries learned embroidery and how to portella with humility, Wu studied politics, history, and literature. She was fascinated by strategy and stories of imperial rule. She did not just read about powerful men. She envisioned herself among them. By the period she reached 14, her beauty, wit, and education attracted the attention of Emperor Taung himself. She was summoned to the imperial palace and became one of the emperor's many concubines. At a first glance, it might have appeared like a dead end. After all, she was ranked fairly low, a barely talented lady among dozens, but Wu had no intention of fading into the background. Even in a palace overflowing with silks and whispers, she stood out. She memorized the emperor's routines, his likes, his moods. She learned the art of silence, of knowing when to speak and when to vanish behind a curtain. But most importantly, she observed. She watched how power was wielded, and more crucially, how it was lost. And when Emperor Taung became ill, Wu Zhao did not panico. She formulated a plan. Upon his death, she should have been dispatched to a Buddhist convent, her life essentially concluded. But Fat, or more accurately, Wu's cleverness, had other designs. She had already captured the interest of the emperor's son, Li Jie, the future Emperor Gaozong, and he had not forgotten her. What followed was the first in a long series of quiet revolutions. Wu was not just a concubine anymore. She was a student of power, and soon she would be its master. The girl once concealed behind a palace screen would become the woman who ruled from the dragon throne. But her ascension had merely begun, and the empire was not prepared for what was approaching. When Emperor Taung died in 649 CE, palace protocol mandated Wuja's next action with chilling clarity. She was to be dispatched to a convent and live out her days, shaved-headed and voiceless. Most former concubines accepted this outcome with quiet resignation. Wu Zhao, however, was not like most. Before Taung's death, she had already commenced a subtle and perilous engagement with his son, Li Ji, the new Emperor Gaozong. Whether it was genuine affection or ruthless calculation, their connection survived the transition of power. And so, barely a year after entering the convent, Wu Zhao returned, not as a discarded widow, but as the emperor's secret consort. The Empress Wang, Gaozong's wife, had ironically orchestrated Wu's return. Hoping to divert the emperor from another rival concubine, she invited Wuzhou back into the palace. She might as well have given her the keys to the empire. Wuzhou performed her new role with chilling elegance. She bore the emperor sans, an advantage no rival could equal. But she did not just give him airs, she gave him ideas. It was not long before she became his closest advisor, whispering concepts that slowly rewrote the mechanisms of state policy and court etiquette. A few said the emperor was in love. Others whispered he was bewitched. Either way, she was now indispensable. Then the blood arrived. The rivalry with Empress Wang and another favored concubine, Consort Xiao, escalated into a quiet war. In 654 CE, tragedy occurred, or was machinated. Wu Jiao's infant daughter died under suspicious circumstances. She accused Empress Wang of murder. What followed was swift and brutal. Wang and Xiao were deposed, imprisoned, and eventually mutilated. Empress Wang's limbs chopped off and her tongue removed. Her finale cries, it was reported, were like those of a pig being slaughtered. Wu Jiao was no empress officially. This was not an ascension, it was a coup disguised as destiny. Wu Jiao had moved from concubine to empress, not with armies, but with alliances, assassinations, and the steady erosion of her enemy's influence. She did not just survive palace life, she bent it to her will. But she was not finished, not even close. She had tasted power. Nov, she wanted the throne itself, not beside the emperor, but above it. And for the first time in China's long and patriarchal history, that unthinkable dream would begin to become reality. By the lot 1660s, Empress Wu was no longer just a consort who whispered advice from behind the screen. She had become the empire's silent puppeteer. Emperor Gaozong's health started to decline, his vision deteriorating, his strength dwindling. In his weakness, Wu Jiao found opportunity. She stepped forward as his proxy, issuing edicts in his name, presiding over court meetings, even reviewing memorials meant for the emperor's eyes alone. Ministers knew the reality, but dared not state it. China was now governed by a woman. At first, Wu Jiao governed cautiously. She supported Buddhism over the traditional Confucian order, using its doctrines to justify her presence in politics. After all, if the Buddha had once appeared as a woman, wouldn't a woman guide the empire? It was spiritual logic with political teeth. She restructured the bureaucracy, promoting officials based on merit instead of family name. This was revolutionary in a court dominated by aristocratic bloodlines. To her supporters, she was a reformer. To her enemies, she was a social arsonist, igniting centuries of tradition. Still, Wu played the long game. She never rushed the throne. Instead, she waited, removing rivals, gathering allies, and mastering the language of statecraft. She planted informants like seeds throughout the bureaucracy. She used the imperial secret police like pruning shears. Any official who opposed her found themselves demoted, exiled, or executed, all while she remained outwardly dutiful to the emperor. In 683, Gaozong died. The natural order should have restored male rule. Their son, Zhongsong, ascended the throne. But when he showed signs of independence, daring to appoint his in-laws to important positions, Wu Jiao struck. She demoted him and installed another son, Ruizong, one easier to control. Behind the throne, she ruled absolutely as Empress Dowager and regent. It was the perfect disguise for authority, a mother protecting the empire in her son's name. But soon even the fiction of male rule began to chaff. "We heed any more," the ministers grumbled. The court scribes whispered. China has never had a female emperor, they warned. It would be unnatural. Wu Jiao listened. Then she quietly began to prepare a new name, a new dynasty, and a new chapter in history where the emperor wore a crown of phoenixes, not dragons. She was not content to rule from the shadows. She was ready to claim the light. In 690 CE, Wu Jiao finally threw aside the veil. No more Proxius, no more Sans, sitting on the throne with her hand behind their backs. She declared the end of the Tang dynasty and announced the birth of a new regime, the Zhou dynasty, named after a golden age of ancient Chinese history, carefully chosen to evoke a legitimacy and virtue. She was no longer Empress Dajia Wu. She was Huangdi Wu Jiao, China's first and only female emperor. The court was astonished. A few scholars recoiled in outrage, citing Confucian texts that spoke of women as obedient, modest, and confined to the inner chambers. But Wu Jiao had already rewritten the rules. She surrounded herself with loyal officials, promoted commoners who owed their rise to her, and crushed dissent before it had time to take root. To reinforce her mandate, she leaned heavily on Buddhism. Temples were built across the empire, proclaiming her as the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. One monk even discovered a scripture declaring that a woman would one day rule the world and bring universal peace. Conveniently, that woman was sitting on the throne. She had portraits painted of herself, seated on the throne with calm authority, and inscriptions carved in stone that praised her as divine monarch. In a patriarchal society, it was nothing short of heresy. And yet, it functioned. Wu Jiao governed with a combination of steel and silk. She strengthened the civil service exam system, ensuring that bureaucrats were chosen by ability, not birthright. She implemented agricultural reforms, lowered burdens on farmers, and increased state revenue. Under her reign, the empire remained largely stable and prosperous. But her power came with a cost. She relied on a secret police network that detected descent like incense smoke in a temple. Court intrigues intensified, critics disappeared, rumors of executions, forced suicides, and torture chambers circulated like dark incense behind palace walls. Even so, she ruled with an iron grace. She wore the dragon robe. She gave imperial audiences. She issued decrees under her own name. For 15 years, Wu Jia wasn't just the most powerful woman in China. She was the most powerful person. She had climbed every rung of a ladder she was never meant to touch, and now she stood alone at the top. Ruling China as its only female emperor brought prestige. But it also made Wu Jia the focal point of every grudge, fear, and wounded ego in the empire. She had rewritten tradition, defied Confucian order, and outmaneuvered generations of noblemen. And that meant one thing. Every individual in silk was watching her and waiting. The court simmered with quiet rebellion. Ministers who bowed by day conspired by candlelight at night. Even among her own children, there was no safety. The sons she had once used as pawns began to resent her absolute control. They wanted power, but Wu had taught them too well how dangerous ambition could be. She trusted none of them to survive. Wao did not just govern. She engaged in a relentless game of psychological chess. Suspected conspirators were removed under vague accusations. Trials were swift, confessions often compelled, and executions popular. Her enemies portrayed her as bloodthirsty. But in reality, she was surgical. This was not mania. It was a method. She created new positions within the bureaucracy, titles that seemed grand but possessed little power. It was her way of rewarding loyalty without relinquishing real control. She also elevated the status of women at court, placing female relatives and trinsted concubines into positions that would have been unthinkable a generation before. Yet, as the years passed, her dependence on a few key people started to cast shadows on her legacy. Two favorites in particular, the Yang brothers, advanced from court entertainers to political insiders. Handsome, charming, and décades younger, they quickly gained favor, and with it, influence. To her critics, this was scandalous. The emperor, once known for her piercing intellect and ruthless command, was now viewed as a lonely woman clinging to youth through the company of fawning courtiers. Whispers of corruption and décadence started to circulate, but those whispers could not erase her accomplishments. Under her reign, literacy expanded, civil service exams were reformed, and state infrastructure improved. She had not just ruled, she had governed effectively. Still, her health began to weaken. Her grasp on power, though still strong, was diminishing. And behind her, vultures circled, eager for a return to normal, to a throne once again occupied by a man. Wuja knew the end was near. The only question now was, would it arrive through illness or betrayal? By the early 700s, Wuja was in her 70s, a mature age for any person, let alone an emperor. Her body became frail, her strength dwindled, and yet her mind remained sharp, ever aware of the shifting currents of court politics. She still governed, but now from a reclining couch behind golden screens hidden from sight, and those closest to her began moving like wolves, sensing weakness. Her dependence on the Jiang brothers, Yang Yi and Jiang Changzong, became a source of ridicule and resentment. Once a charming favorite, they were now considered corrupt sycophants who manipulated imperial decisions for their own advantage. Ministers who had long accepted their presence began to plot. In 705 CE, the palace finally broke. A group of senior officials and generals executed a swift coup. It was not bloody. It did not need to be. The empress was surrounded, her allies captured, and the Jiang brothers were summarily put to death, their heads displayed to the court as a signal. The phoenix's wings had been clipped. Faced with overwhelming pressure and deteriorating health, Wu Jiao had no alternative but to abdicate. She was compelled to step down and restore her son, Yongshong, to the throne, the Sami son she had previously dismissed for daring to think for himself. She withdrew into retirement, her once vast court reduced to a small entourage. And yet, even in abdication, she retained her title as emperor and continued to exert a degree of influence behind closed doors. China may have changed the name on its throne, but the echo of Wu Jiao's reign still lingered in every policy, every law, every shaken official, afraid of another woman with ideas. She passed away latter that same year. No grand tomb inscription, no flowery epitaph. Her name was quietly taken from official histories. The Tang dynasty obliterated her as thoroughly as they could, as if her reign had been a bad dream they preferred not to recall. But history, like Wu Jiao herself, is hard to silence. For decades afterward, poets and scholars debated her. Was she a usurper or a visionary? A tyrant or a reformer, a murderer or a savior of the state? What is surer is this. She broke every rule the empire tried to craft for her, and for 15 years she did not just defy history. She became it. After her death in 705 CE, the Tang moved quickly to obliterate Wu Jiao's unprecedented reign. Official histories were rewritten. Her reforms were credited to her male successors. Her name carved into records, and temples was scrapped out, replaced with safer, more familiar male names. Yet, despite the state's efforts, Wuja refused to dissipate. The people remembered her. Scholars could not ignore her. Foreign emissaries continued to mention the female emperor who once governed the greatest empire on earth. And in a strange turn of fate, it was the very scholars and historians assigned to minimize her legacy who ensured its continuation. You can remove a name, but not a reign that shaped a generation. Her accomplishments were undeniable. She had elevated Buddhism to new prominence, making it a central pillar of imperial legitimacy. She had restructured the civil service, making exams more meritocratic and reducing aristocratic nepotism. She had defended the empire's borders, launched successful military campaigns, and kept internal rebellion largely in check, an achievement most male rulers could only hope for. And for women, Wu's reign was a brief, radiant constellation in a dark ski of subjugation. She appointed women to key positions, funded female education, and offered unprecedented access to the levers of power. Her rule became a mythic precedent, proof that a woman could not only survive the palace, but dominate it. Still, her legacy is entangled. Later, Confucian historians depicted her as a monster in makeup, a femme fatale who seduced her way to power and bathed her court in blood. Stories of her cruelty were exaggerated, her lovers multiplied, her ruthlessness elevated to nearly demonic proportions. It was easier to villainize her than to admit she had outperformed many of her male predecessors. But modern historians have begun to balance the scales. Today, Wu Jiao is recognized not just as a powerful woman, but as one of the most effective rulers in Chinese history, male or female. Her reign, complex and contradictory, remains a masterclass in statecraft, political survival, and ideological manipulation. She ruled in a team that said she should be silent. She conquered a system built to destroy her, and in the ashes of her erasure, her name still burns. Quiet, powerful, and unforgettable. To understand Wu's reign is to understand the China she shaped, not just through edicts and executions, but through culture, ideology, and identity. Her rule was not just a political anomaly, it was a civilizational pivot point. For one, she redefined what it meant to be imperial. Traditional emperors surrounded themselves with Confucian scholars and war generals. Wu Jiao, in contrast, built her court around Buddhist monks, scholars from humble backgrounds, and fiercely loyal officials who owed their careers to her vision of meritocracy. This fundamentally altered the power structure of the Tang dynasty. Under Wu Jiao, the civil service exams became more inclusive and rigorous. This empowered scholars from poorer, non-noble families, a dramatic shift away from the aristocratic monopolies that had dominated since the Han dynasty. In performing this, she laid the groundwork for a more dynamic, educated bureaucracy that would endure long after her death. Culturally, she initiated a golden age of Buddhist art and architecture. Temples, pagodas, and colossal statues were erected in her name and image. At Longmen Grotto, a massive statue of Vairocana Buddha bears unmistakable features resembling Wu herself, regal, calm, and all-seeing. These were not just religious offerings, they were political monuments. Each structure whispered the same radical message. A woman could embody cosmic order. She also changed the language of rulership. Wuzhou introduced dozens of new Chinese characters into official usage, a few to express abstract virtues, others designed specifically to glorify her rule. Most of these characters vanished after her reign, but the audacity of crafting a new script to describe a new regime reveals much about her vision. Perhaps most revolutionary was her manipulation of gender roles. By portraying herself as both mother and sovereign, she fused the intimate and the imperial. She did not challenge masculinity directly. She absorbed it into her persona. she was at once the nurturing protector and the ruthless enforcer, the dragon and the phoenix, the emperor and the empress. Her empire was not perfect. Dissent was punished severely. Trust was a scarce commodity. But it operated, evolved, and expanded under her, and that despite centuries of resistance to her legacy cannot be denied. Wu Zhao did not just rule the Tang dynasty, she remodeled it. Wu Zhao died over 2,300 years ago, and yet the echo of her reign still ripples through China's cultural memory, a haunting melody of brilliance, brutality, and bold defiance. While her name was once removed from stone and banished from official records, Team has a method of unearthing what history attempts to bury. In the centuries that followed, she became a paradox. In popular folklore, she was depicted as everything from a cruel seductress to a divine ruler. Opera tropes dramatized her life, sometimes portraying her as a tragic heroine, sometimes as a ruthless tyrant. She was demonized, sanctified, misunderstood, and yet never forgotten. No woman in China's history has ever matched her clim or her crown. Others held power as dowagers or regents, but none ever declared themselves emperor. None dared to remake dynasties, rewrite language, or stand alone at the summit of the world's most powerful throne. And the legacy of that fact that she broke the unbreakable rule continues to inspire debate. To a Portion, she remains a cautionary story, the péril of ambition unbound, of femininity in armor. But to others, especially modern historians, feminists, and political thinkers, she is something else entirely. A symbol of resilience, a case study in raw political genius, a monument to the cost and consequence of leading when you were never intended to. Even today, Wu Zhao is more than a historical figure. She's a mirror. In her ascension, you see the mechanisms of systemic injustice functioning, and in her reign, the moment they were jammed. She did not just defy expectations, she obliterated them. And yet, she also paid the price of greatness. Her legacy remains clouded by moral ambiguity. She used fear as much as fairness. Her enemies died not just in disgrace, but sometimes without judgment, their voices lost to history. Her compassion was selective, her justice strategic. She was not a saint, but she was never attempting to be. Wu Zhao ruled not to be liked, but to survive. And in surviving, she created history. And so she remains, the woman emperor who rose from the shadows of concubinage, who walked into a world that said no and answered with a throne. In a land of dragons, she crowned herself the phoenix. And in that flame, she burned her name into eternity. In the ancient world, a road was not just a convenience, it was a declaration of power. The moment a ruler ordered a road to be carved through forest, desert, or mountain, it was not about ease of travel. It was about control. Roads were empire in motion. Unlike rivers or oceans which nature dictated, roads were human impositions. They sliced through geography, tethered distant outposts to capitals, and reminded every individual from merchant to rebel that civilization had reached. A good road meant troops could move fast, taxes could be collected efficiently, and goods from the frontier could be brought to the heart of the empire. The earliest known roads go back to Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. These were not paved highways, but compacted dirt paths used for carts and trade caravans. Even then, societies realized something crucial. When people move, ideas, goods, and influence move with them, and whoever constructs the path controls the flow. In ancient Persia, the royal road stretched over 100 miles from Sardis to Susa. It had way stations, rest areas, and royal couriers who could gallop across the empire in record team. Herodotus claimed a message could travel its full length in just 7 days. That velocity was not just impressive, it was intimidating. It meant that the king's voice could reach every corner of the empire in days, not weeks. But it was the Romans who perfected the road as an imperial instrument. They built over 50,000 miles of stone-paved roads across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Straight, durable, and astonishingly well-engineered, these roads were designed not for beauty, but for efficiency. Marching legions, grain shipments, imperial messengers, each depended on that stone beneath their fea. Roman roads often started with military purposes in mind, but their civilian impact was just as transformative. Farmers could get their goods to markets. Travelers could cross regions in safety. Cities became linked not just by politics, but by stone and sweat. In every civilization that mattered, the road was never just about transportation. It was about transformation. Because to build a road was to reshape the land, and with it reshape the power that ruled it. If the ancient world had an engineering superpower, it was Rome. And their greatest tool was not just the aqueduct or the arch, it was the road. Roman roads were not just pathways, they were the bones of an empire. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was not metaphorical, it was logistical. The Romans built over 50,000 miles of roads, stone-lined, expertly drained, and arrow-straight. They connected Britain to Egypt, the Rhine to the Danube, and every strategic military outpost in between. These roads made the empire feel smaller, faster, and more manageable. Roman engineers followed a formula. First, they chose a route, not necessarily the easiest, but often the straightest. Then came surveying oozing tools like the groma for right angles and distance. Once the path was set, they began excavation. A Roman road was built in layers like a cake of conquest. The bottom layer, statumen, was made of large stones. Above that came rudis, a mix of crushed stone and lime. Next was nucleus, a layer of compacted sand or gravel. Finally, the sum dorsume, a paved top of interlocking stone slabs, often crowned in the center for water runoff. The result was a road that could withstand centuries of weather, hoovies, and sandals. A few are still in use today, but engineering was only half the story. Roman roads came with infrastructure, mile markers, rest stops, and way stations called manions where officials and messengers could rest and resupply. The cursus publicus, Rome's courier system, used these roads to move messages across the empire at astonishing speed, nearly 50 meters a day in some cases. And the roads moved more than mile. They moved legends, a rebellion in Gaul, a skirmish in Judea. Roman troops could march hundreds of miles faster than any enemy expected. Roads became an extension of Rome's military muscle, silent, solid, and always advancing. But with soldiers came settlers, and with settlers came citius. Roads encouraged trade, migration, and the spread of Roman law, language, and architecture. They were arteries pumping culture as well as conquest. For Rome, a road was not a luxury. It was a necessity, a symbol, a message carved in stone that said, "Rome is here." And wherever Rome built, the world changed beneath their fea. While Rome built roads in stone, the Inca Empire built them in the ski. Stretching over 25,000 miles, the Chapacnian, the great Inca road system, was a marvel of Andean engineering. It tied together one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth, connecting deserts, jungles, and mountains that soared past 13,000 feet in altitude. And the Inca did it all without the wheel, without draft animals beyond the llama, and without metal tools in the European sense. This was not just a road system. It was the spine of an empire. At the heart of it all was Cusco, the Inca capital, radiating out like spokes on a sunhe. The roads linked provincial centers, military outposts, agricultural hubs, and sacred seats. The most famous stretch is the Inca Trail, which winds its way to Machu Picchu. But that was just one thread in a vast imperial web. The roads varied in size and construction. In the lowlands they were wide and paved with stone. In the high mountains they were narrow paths cut into cliffs, sometimes no more than a foot wide. Where rivers ran, the Incor built rope suspension bridges using woven grass, strong enough to support travelers and caravans of llamas. These bridges had to be remade yearly, a community ritual that still survives in parts of Peru today. There were no wheeled carts. All transport was by foot or by llama. But the Incas had something even more efficient: chasqui relay runners. These messengers sprinted between tambos or rest stations built every few miles. Massage, food, and even fresh fish from the coast could reach the emperor in Cusco within days. This system allowed the empire to function with astonishing speed, despite having no written script. But the roads were also spiritual. Many followed segways, sacred lines that radiated from Cusco to shrines and mountains. Travel was not just practical, it was symbolic. Each step reinforced imperial order and religious harmony. The Chapacinian was not a Roman-style conquest machine. It was a tether, a way to hold a vertical empire together. From snow-capped peaks to coastal deserts, the roads made unity possible. And though much of it is gone today, a few stretches still endure. Stones fitted without mortar, still carrying footsteps after 500 years. The Incor did not just conquer the Andes. They stitched it together, one path at a time. Centuries before Rome and far from the Andean peaks, another empire stitched together its vast territory with stone and strategy, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And at its heart ran the Royal Road, a 1,500 meters engineering triumph, stretching from Sardis in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, to Susa, one of the Persian capitals. Commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE, the Royal Road was not just a way to move goods. It was a political artery, a demonstration of imperial sophistication, and one of the earliest true long-distance highways in recorded history. The Persians did not invent roads, but they standardized them, militarized them, and made them the foundation of bureaucracy. Their engineers scouted routes that balanced terrain with directness, avoiding swamps and scaling mountains when necessary. The result was a surprisingly smooth and fast connection across a continent-spanning empire. Herodotus wrote that royal messenger could cross the Antir Royal Road in 7 days, a journey that would have taken a regular traveler about 90 days. How? The system of relay stations. Every 15, 18 miles, there were posting stations with fresh horses and supplies. Couriers would switch horses and continue riding at top speed, a system that prefigured the Pony Express by over 2,000 years. But these roads were not only for messengers. Merchants, military units, diplomats, and tax collectors used them constantly. The Royal Road helped unite a multi-ethnic empire that included Greeks, Mess, Egyptians, Babylonians, and more. It made possible something extraordinary in the ancient world: central oversight of distant provinces. Road guards ensured safety, and caravanserais provided shelter and provisions. The entire system relied on maintenance and order, two things the Persian bureaucracy excelled at. Road crews were deployed to fix damage, and tolls were sometimes collected at river crossings or mountain passes. The Persians also pioneered road markers and milestones. tools for measuring distance and ensuring consistency across regions. These practices would echo later in Rome and Byzantium. The royal rod did not survive the fall of Persia intact, but its influence lingered. Alexander the Great used it to invade the empire. The Romans later expanded upon the concept. Even today, modern highways follow parts of its ancient route. It proved one powerful idea. An empire is not ruled by sword alone. It is ruled by the speed of a message and the strength of the road it travels. While the Romans were laying stone in Europe and the Incas were carving trails through the Andes, another empire was quietly building a road network that would shape the world in a different way. Han Dynasty China. Their roads did not just connect cities. They united a civilization and fueled the rise of one of the most legendary trade systems in human history, the Silk Road. Under the Han Dynasty, especially during the reign of Emperor Wu, R41 to 87 BCE, roads became a tool for expansion and control. The government poured resources into constructing and maintaining long-distance routes that extended from the imperial capital of Tianjin into Central Asia. These roads were not just for merchants, they were vital military and administrative arteries. Unlike Roman roads, Han roads were not uniformly stone-paved. Many were hard-packed dirt or gravel, occasionally reinforced with planks in muddy regions or stone slabs in high-traffic areas. But what they lacked in uniform engineering, they made up for in scale and organization. The postal relay system known as the Yichuan was remarkably advanced. Stations were placed at regular intervals, complete with fresh horses and accommodations for government messengers. This allowed imperial decrees and tax records to travel across thousands of miles with surprising speed. These roads supported not just governance, but diplomacy and trade. Envoys like Jiang Chen, who journeyed westward into Central Asia, opened up contact with cultures as far as Persia and India. Silk, jade, paper, and spices flowed outward. In return, China received horses, glassware, and new agricultural ideas. Security was essential. The Han invested heavily in maintaining military garrisons along the routes, especially near the Gansu Corridor, a narrow windswept strip of land that acted as a gateway between China and the West. Watchtowers, beacon mounds, and walled settlements dotted the road, creating a lattice of imperial presence. Culturally, the road system enabled the spread of Confucianism, Buddhism, and administrative practices across diverse regions. Travelers, monks, soldiers, and merchants moved ideas along with goods, shaping a unified identity that would last long beyond the Han. Han roads were not built to impress, they were built to endure. And while many vanished beneath later cities or were reclaimed by dust and desert, their legacy remained. Because through these roads, China did not just defend its borders, it opened a door to the world. The ancient Greeks are rarely celebrated for their roads. They did not build grand highways like the Romans or stretch vast networks like the Persians. But what they did construct, though more modest in scale, reveals how roads could shape not only commerce and war, but culture, religion, and identity. Greece's rugged mountainous terrain made road building difficult and expensive. So instead of imperial highways, the Greeks developed a patchwork of stone-paved local routes, often connecting city-states instead of unifying a vast empire. These roads followed natural terrain and were typically narrow, just wide enough for pack animals or chariots. Yet, despite their simplicity, they played a crucial role in the Greek world. One of the most famous routes was the Sacred Way from Athens to Eleusis, used during the Eleusinian Mysteries. Religious festivals dedicated to Data and Persephone. Ayak year, thousands of initiates walk this road in a grand procession, chanting hymns and carrying offerings. For them, the road was not just a path. It was a rite of passage, a journey from the world of the living into mystery and transformation. Another iconic route was the Pan-Hellenic Road leading to Delhi, the home of the Oracle of Apollo. Pilgrims, kings, and philosophers alike took this winding road through mountains and valleys to consult the oracle. Along the way were treasuries, shrines, and inscribed stones, forming a spiritual journey as much as a physical one. But Greek roads were not only sacred. They were used by soldiers, philosophers, and traders. Think of Xenophon's Anabasis, describing the long retreat of Greek mercenaries through Persia, a brutal road-bound odyssey. Or imagine Socrates, who often walked from the Agora to the Academy or the Lyceum to teach under the open sky, his fiat tracing worn paths of dialogue and debate. What set Greek roads apart was not their engineering, it was their integration into daily life. They were not built by emperors to display dominance. They emerged organically, shaped by marketplaces, sanctuaries, and social rituals. And through them, ideas traveled just as fast as soldiers or carts. Philosophy, theater, democracy, even Olympic athletes. They all moved on dusty, narrow roads that wound through olive groves and city gates. Simple as they were, Greek roads carried the weight of a civilization that changed the world, not by force, but by thought. In ancient India, roads were not just channels of commerce. They were arteries of spiritual life, imperial governance, and cultural exchange. From the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd century BCE to latter Gupta rule, Indian civilizations developed a remarkably organized road network that connected fertile river valleys, coastal ports, trade towns, and holy cities. The most transformative period for ancient Indian roads came under Emperor Ashoka, the Buddhist monarch who ruled most of the subcontinent around 268–232 BCE. After renouncing violence following the bloody King Kalinga War, Ashoka turned to popular welfare, and roads became a central feature of that transformation. Ashoka ordered the construction and expansion of roads across his empire. These were not just dirt paths. They were deliberately engineered routes, often lined with trees for shade, wells for water, and rest houses for travelers. He placed inscribed stone pillars along the roads, not to mark distances, but to declare edicts, urging compassion, truthfulness, and religious tolerance. It was governance by visibility. The most famous of these roads ran from Pataliputra, modern-day Patna, to the northwest frontier, connecting the Ganges Plain to present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. This stretch later became a part of the northern trade route that would evolve into the Silk Road, linking India to China, Persia, and the Greco-Roman world. Indian roads carried more than goods. They carried faiths and philosophies. Buddhist monks walked these roads to spread their teachings. Hindu pilgrims used them to journey between sacred rivers and temples. Even Giant sagas took to these routes in quiet contemplation. The roads became bridges between ideas. Trade flourished. From the eastern coast, goods like spices, textiles, ivory, and gems traveled inland and outward, reaching Roman ports and Central Asian markets. Roads linked urban centers like Taxila, Ujjain, and Varanasi, each a hub of commerce and scholarship. Though many Indian roads were not paved like Roman ones, they were maintained seasonally, especially before monsoon rains. Engineers used gravel, wood planks, and packed earth, often elevated slightly to prevent flooding. What made India's ancient road system unique was not brute force. It was plurality. Roads served kings, farmers, saints, and scholars alike. They did not just connect empires, they connected worldviews. And in that blend of purpose, part political, part spiritual, part economic, India paved not just roads, but pathways to influence that would stretch far beyond its borders. Ancient roads were not just flat paths stretching across the land. They were feats of engineering that overcame rivers, ravines, and rugged terrain. To build effective roads, civilizations had to master the art of bridge building, drainage, and durable construction. The Romans were pioneers in bridge engineering. Their roads often crossed vast rivers using stone arch bridges, structures that could support heavy loads and endure centuries. The Pontoglio in Rome and the Alcantara Bridge in Spain are prime examples. The Roman arch used keystones and carefully cut stones, distributing weight perfectly. Their bridges were not just practical, they were symbols of imperial power, inviting awe and respect. But the Romans were not alone. The Inca, faced with wild rivers cutting through Andean gorges, built rope suspension bridges crafted from woven grasses and vines. These bridges were lightweight but incredibly strong, rebuilt annually by local communities in rituals still practiced today. Crossing these bridges was not just a physical challenge, but a cultural one, binding communities to the land and to each other. In ancient China, engineers developed bayum bridges and pontoon bridges. The famous Xiao Bridge, built during the Sui dynasty, completed in 605 CE, is the world's oldest open spandrel stone segmental arch bridge. It combined aesthetic grace with remarkable engineering, allowing heavy traffic to cross the Jing River for centuries. Drainage was equally critical. Roman roads were crowned in the center to shed rainwater quickly with ditches on either side. In the wet and monsoon-prone lands of India and Southeast Asia, roads were often elevated on causeways or filled with gravel layers to prevent washouts. A few emperors even built roads with multiple layers of materials, compacted soil, stones, gravel, and paving slabs to ensure durability. Beyond bridges and drainage, the creation of way stations and mile markers along ancient roads provided travelers with rest, supplies, and orientation, early versions of highway rest stops. These engineering achievements did not just facilitate movement. They shaped economies, warfare, and culture. A bridge could mean the difference between an army crossing into enemy lands or being stopped cold. A well-maintained road could mean the survival of a city through trade and communication. Ultimately, the engineering behind ancient roads was an expression of human ingenuity, a testament to how societies adapted to and reshaped their environments to move people, goods, and ideas across vast landscapes. Throughout history, ancient roads were more than mere pathways. They were the lifelines that allowed empires to thrive, expand, and endure. Roads connected distant cities and remote villages, enabling trade, communication, and cultural exchange that defined civilizations. Empires understood that without efficient roads, armies could not move quickly, governors could not enforce law, and merchants could not prosper. Roads shaped economic hubs, encouraged urban growth, and even influenced the spread of religions and philosophies. The Silk Road, the Roman Via Appia, the Incan Capican all carried more than just goods. They carried ideas and identities. The maintenance of these roads required vast bureaucracies and dedicated labor forces reflecting the organizational prowess of empires like Rome, Persia, China, and the Incas. Roads became a measure of an empire's reach and stability. When roads were kept in good repair, empires flourished. When neglected, regions drifted into isolation, rebellion, or decline. But roads also symbolize human ambition, the desire to connect, control, and communicate across vast spaces. They show how early engineers and leaders understood geography not just as a barrier, but as a canvas to reshape. Today, many ancient roads lie beneath modern highways, while others remain as archaeological treasures. They remind us that the infrastructure we often take for granted was once a monumental achievement, paved with sweat, stone, wood, and ingenuity. The legacy of ancient roads is alive in every journey we take, every letter sent, and every trade route that links our globalized world. They are the silent architects of empire, culture, and civilization. In essence, the story of ancient roads is the story of humanity itself, ever on the move, building bridges, both literal and metaphorical, across time and space.